got three gentlemen on our panel. One is Walsh County Extension Agent Brad Brummond. Brad's been around the block a time or two, been with Extension for longer than I have, just a wealth of knowledge, and he's a go-to guy for us agents. When we get stumped and stuff, we're just looking for a little maybe advice or what's happened here. He's a go-to guy, just like these other two gentlemen up here are for many of you with some of their crop consulting. We got Jason Hodous with JNS Agronomy, and we have Jason Hansen with Rock and Roll Agronomy. I'm happy to see the guy who started this program some 42 years ago, Terry Gregoire, been thinking about having him come and just participate in this event over time, and somehow this year it just kind of came together, and I sprung it on him about moderating, and apparently I didn't communicate the best to let him know that he was doing this, so he's a little rusty. He's been a few years, and I'll let Terry say how many years it's been since he started this program back in the late 70s, early 1980s. And we also have Mr. Gregoire. He's got a session tomorrow at 9 a.m. Hopefully our weather holds for us. He's going to reminisce and talk a little bit about how this whole thing got started. So I guess we're gonna go. Enjoy.
Mr. Gregoire, I don't think I've ever heard Scott say that to me before. That's pretty good.
Just happy to see you.
Well, thank you. It's good to be back, and then tomorrow we'll go through a little bit of the history of Roundup. It's lots of familiar faces out here, and I hope some names come to my brain when I have a chance to shake your hand and talk to you. Anyway, the first, and we'll say that tomorrow, I'm not going to spend any time on it. These guys have got more important things to talk about than that, but it was 1979, December 12th, 13th, and 14th. It was called anybody remember what it was called? Sunflower Growers Conference is where this whole thing started. But anyway, today I think it's really one of the functions that Extension Roundup over the years has enjoyed providing is the global expertise and the everyday expertise that these guys up here bring to the table. But I also want to have you and encourage you to ask questions today. You have a lot of experience out in the farms. You run a large-scale experiment station sometimes every year, not knowing what's going to happen. And last year, a lot of things occurred that you didn't like with no rain and a lot of heat. And for some, maybe turned out to have some good crops, I suspect, not being real familiar with a lot of problems. Things like that cause decisions for next year. Stored soil moisture. I understand fertilizer prices are through the roof, maybe approaching $1 a pound for nitrogen. Is that about what it is? That's what I've heard. And so what kind of decisions does that bring for you next year in terms of lowering some of those costs? Maybe you're looking at legumes, maybe you're looking at some alternative crops other than what you had before. So this morning, we'd like to start probably with Jason on that end, and we'll just go that way with the insights that they had. And when they're through with a few of their comments like that and what they think the future will bring, we'd like to invite each of you to ask questions, and please do that. You've had a lot of experience. There's some questions out there that came to your mind. This is your opportunity to hear from these fellows who have a tremendous amount of experience in the field and over the years to comment on that and get some of their insights. So it's good to be back. Good to see you all. And now, Jason, if you'd start it off. All right. I've got this mic, so if you just raise your hand, I'll bring it out to you so they can everybody can hear the question.
Like they said, I'm Jason Hodous. I live here in the Lake region, crop consultant here for 12 years or so now. 2022 looks like, there's going to be some challenges. I hear a lot of availability challenges, speaking for chemicals or, on the chemical side of things, warehouses were full last year. A lot of guys I talk to now, warehouses are not full. That's probably going to be one of our bigger issues is the availability of certain products. Clethodim, I heard that is real tight. Roundup, I know everybody's heard, glyphosate tight. Glufosinate, real short. So availability on stuff like that, on all of it really is going to be an issue. Another thing we're talking fertilizer prices. It's like the phone never quits ringing. What are we going to do? Oh my God, we've got $900 urea, we've got $1,600 anhydrous. 1152 is through the roof. What are we going to do? And it's going to be a challenge to deal with the prices on stuff the way it is, but on the other hand, the way crop prices and stuff are right now, we can still kind of figure things out and hopefully make things work out in the long run. I am encouraged that we do have a little snow on the ground. I don't want a whole lot more, but it's going to be a little nice. We got some moisture towards the end of the season last year, which should help significantly. And with the snowpack that we got now and a little more in the forecast, we might be sitting a little better, moisture-wise. And I guess one of the other big things going into 22 that I'm a little bit leery about is, kosher control, weed control, powell, pigweed, whatever, water hemp. It's with a lot of the weed kind of not really getting abandoned, but not getting treated like we normally would treat it. There's going to be some issues, with lots of kosher. There's going to be lots of powell. There's going to be more water hemp like there is every year. So, just the weed spectrum, wild oats is horrible. I don't know. We need to figure something else out for wild oat control because, that's going to be a big thing here coming up in 22 because it just didn't get taken care of in some of the acres or whatever last year. So there's, just a couple, 2-3 different things that I see in 22 that are going to be a challenge and stuff that we need to be on top of before the growing season. We need to get ahead of this stuff and make sure we have a good plan, I guess, before we start with the machinery in the field.
Jason Hansen with Agronomy. Live up in the Webster area, that's my main consulting area. A lot of stuff that Jason just said, absolutely concerning, but a couple things that I think are very positive is that if you go back to last fall, we had no moisture, and last winter we had no snow, and it was supposed to rain this spring, and it didn't. And so we're sitting in a much better place. I went out and did some soil sampling in April, and I hate spring soil sampling because all it is you fight mud, you drive or you don't get stuck, your sample is not that good. It was just like in April, it was like I was out in the fields in October. And I stuck a canola field, and there was some moisture and there was some frost, and it probed so nice. And I went to a soybean field, and it was like powder. There was no moisture. I'm like, this is not good, because we're going to deal with some tremendously bad stands unless it rains. And it always rains until it doesn't rain. And that's what we have this year. So I feel really good about the rains we've had, the moisture, the soil profile, fall soil sampling is good. The moisture we've had, a couple other things that happened because it was so dry. It seemed like more people just didn't work fields. They left them in stubble, and there was a lot more burn down. And I think that's going to pay off some big benefits coming this spring because of the shortages that Jason talked about. We can help ourselves out with what we did there. And it was great sitting and listening to the 3 talks that were up here this morning, because that variety thing is important, and then it ties into that disease thing. Because what Terry talked about with a $1 price at N, there's going to be some rotations this year that are going to get totally messed up, because if you're sitting with 75 or higher pounds at N, you're going to see things that you're going to see more wheat on wheat, or barley on barley, or corn on wheat, and vice versa. And you're probably going to see more beans on beans. we're probably going to see that just because you're going to utilize that. So that ties into that whole disease talk, that ties into that whole variety selection thing. And then because of the moisture and those costs are up, but we did come out because of the drought with higher residual nitrogen levels. So there is somewhat of a positive there, even though it probably came at the sacrifice of yield. The price has helped out on that scenario. So our biggest challenge is definitely going to be crop protection and just having a plan and seeing how the spring breaks. I think that's going to be having a plan and going forward.
That's interesting, Jason. I think one of the things that I haven't heard either one of you mention, though, was the value of soil testing and find out where those residual levels are. And, you talked about the soybean, guys might think they could go in there and have residual land and that type of stuff that's going to be elsewhere. So the value of soil testing and knowing where your N is, particularly with high N cost, is going to be significant too.
I think for yields or residual nitrogen levels, it's high, but it's not as high as you go back to 88 and 89. Those are still two of the highest years. And we remember, and probably the other positive thing was, if you think of our farming practices in 88, 89, and where our yields at out of that drought, then that drought was worse. But look at the yields and the crop diversity and how we yielded this way. So our genetics are better, our farming practices are better. We just got to make sure we do a few things a little differently this year. I'm very concerned with kochia because of the dry weather. It just came on so hard and so quick. So that's one of the things I'm going to pay attention to. And the other thing that we had this year that was just a really tough time was the fact that we experienced, Andrew Friskop said we didn't have any humidity, basically. If you don't have scab, you don't have humidity. And when you don't have humidity, you see how crop protection products don't like to perform, particularly Liberty is one. And the other thing that happened with low humidity was, anybody have any diamondback moths to deal with this year in canola? That was because of low humidity. So every year's different. We'll see what happens, but I stated this is going to be the funnest year to be an agronomist in the history of mankind. Because it's going to be the most challenging. There's a lot of things that are out of our control, but there are things we can, and that's just kind of the fun of it, I guess, for me.
I'm Brad Brummond. I started Extension June 7th, 1982, so I've probably been a county agent longer than most of you have been alive, okay? I can't say that I've learned everything, and I can't believe they've hired me, and some of you out there probably still can't believe they've hired me. But there's a couple things that I see. I think this is a year that we need to take advantage of what we have. And if there's some advantage to what happened last year, and it's different all over. We had wheat in Walls County that ran anywhere from 10 to 90 bushels. Just depends upon where the rain fell and the soil types and a lot of different things that happen. So the first thing I think is very critical is that at least some of the fall tests that we came in, we were pushing well over 100 pounds of nitrogen. That's 100 pounds of nitrogen you shouldn't have to buy. Know what your soil tests are, you know where it is, and maybe on those high nitrogen testing soils, maybe we don't put down dry beans on them. Maybe we do something else. I mean, like Jason said, I think this is the year we mess up our rotations, and probably justifiably so. I've hardly ever had a chance to recommend wheat on wheat in Walls County, simply because wheat's kind of the poor orphan child. But when you're facing with all that nitrogen, you're going to throw wheat down, you're going to throw corn down, you're going to throw, dry beans is such a great idea, and with the growth patterns and some of the things that we're seeing, you want to be using what you can use. The other thing, I think, how many of you are familiar with Nitrogen Calculator, Dave Franzen's program? You need to go, just Google David Franzen or Soil Science or Nitrogen Calculator on the NDSU website. And what they have there, they've got wheat, they've got corn, and they've got several different crops up there. And what you do is you plug in where you live in the state, what your soil tests are, what the previous crops were, what the price of your N is, what the price of your phosphorus is, and it calculates recommendations for your fertility needs. And you know what? What I really like about that program is you can play what if. What if the nitrogen, they take the tariffs off the fertilizer and the nitrogen price and the phosphorus price come down? So what does that change for us? So now are we going to fertilize for these big yields, or we're going to call back because we got $1 nitrogen? I mean, where are we at? It allows you to do that. So I really would really strongly suggest that you get some soil tests and you make use of that. The other thing I think that maybe we should be looking at this year is that we have an option right now until March to do our FSA payments, our ARC or our PLC, ARC individual, ARC county. Does that change for you? Let's just not look at the agronomy side. I think we need to look across the board. Now, in Walsh County, I drove through a blizzard to get here. We got a lot of snow on the ground, and that's a good thing. And what's really a good thing is it's not all in the ditches. I think that I drove around last fall and I was going to take pictures. I said, you know what? I've been harping on what's not working with erosion. I said, I'm going to go and take pictures of what's working. And I took pictures of stubble that they dragged with heavy drag and left up. I've seen a lot of rye cover crop. I've seen strip till. I have seen a minimum till. I think, at least in Walsh County, I think we turned the car really hard on some of the things that we did. And you know what? I think we're going to learn that maybe we didn't need to do some of the things that we did. Okay. I mean, one of the things about learning, and Terry said, you run one big experiment station farms out there. It's your farm. And doing things different, it's sometimes not a bad thing if you do it on a small scale. I think we're going to see a 900% increase in strip till sugar beet acres in Walsh County this year, because it did very well last year, and we'll see how that works. The other thing that I think I'm a little concerned about, and this weed wasn't brought up, is that we've got a little weed around Hommy Dam in the Park River area called narrowleaf foxbeard, and that weed is moving. I found it in my garden, I found it in my plots, and I think it got into the riprap of Hommy Dam, and I've been down trying to pull it out. I've had my daughter down trying to pull it out. You ever try to get your college daughter to pull weeds out of the riprap on a hot summer day in Hommy Dam? And you better be contributing a lot of money to her tuition. A lot of whining going on. Yeah, narrowly foxbeard, and it looks like a dandelion that has about 20 heads. It's got a little dandelion type head, and if you look at it when in the rosette state, you're going to call it a dandelion. And that's a bad mistake, because that stuff is very prolific. Hommy Dam personally mowed out nearly foxbeard 4 times, and it's still 7 years ahead. We're very aggressive, and we missed the opportunity to get this weed, which was last fall. You know, one of the unfortunate parts about last fall was, or fortunate, we got some moisture to germinate this weed. So I think that's one you want to be looking forward. If you got something out there that looks like a dandelion, you go out there and make sure if it is a dandelion or not a dandelion. It's not so hard to take out of spring wheat, but it's a son of a gun. I've helped farmers pull a lot of foxbeard out of dry beans. It likes dry beans, it likes peas, it likes the legumes. So narrowleaf foxbeard should be on your radar. I think the other thing that if you've had hay millet or brought in hay from outside the area, I think you want to be looking for your pigweed species. If you're feeding screenings from down south in some of these infested areas, again, watch where these things are at. And I would agree with you. With some of the things that were said here, I think one of the worst wheat problems in Walsh County now is not water hemp, it's actually pollen. I see more pollen than I see water hemp, unfortunately, in a lot of these areas. And quite frankly, and these two guys can argue with me, I don't see a lot of difference between pollen and water hemp. I think they're resistant to a lot of the same things. And you need, in my mind, you treat them the same way. You seek and destroy. Don't drag them up and down the township roads and see the county agent a week later. I've seen that done. I'm surprised I haven't got it all over my, my plots right now. But those are some things that I see. I do see some of the switch into our legume acres. I think we're going to plan up our dry bean acres in Walsh County. I think we're going to be looking for some of the alternative ways to save money. And again, get yourself a soil test. Go to Dave Franzen's website and do his nitrogen calculator and do his fertility stuff. So you spend your money on what you need to spend it on. I don't think we can afford the luxury of phosphorus building and just running without soil tests, because people ask me all the time, well, what do I put down for fertilizer? I said, well, what's soil test? Well, I don't soil test. I'm sorry, I'm around 40 years, I don't have an answer for that. So, and I think again, we need to be on the watch out for some of those. We had some fields they walked away from this last year, Walsh County. And those fields could be problematic. Walsh County, we have a green foxtail population that is nasty. I don't know how many of you have experienced green foxtail. I sent in some green foxtail from the Lincoln area that they literally threw the kitchen sink at it, and it didn't seem to be greatly effective. I don't know what you're dealing with green foxtail, but right now in central Walsh County, green foxtail is becoming almost as problematic as our favorite. That's about what I have to say.
Well, thank you, all three of you, for your comments. Just to summarize a little bit of what I heard was resistant weeds, Jason over there, and also from Brad. I heard some concerns about seedbed establishment. Last year it occurred, probably in areas with not so much stuff. We'll see how the snow goes and the rain. I had to kind of chuckle, Jason, when you said they expected rain to happen. And that old half-inch miracle that occurs, and when it doesn't occur, makes bad management decisions even worse. So seedbed preparation and Hansen is really good. Again, I can remember quite a few things, but 1980, same thing kind of happened. We had 100-degree temperatures in April 20th, and everybody thought, well, I'll just plant, and didn't know where to plant, and went out and planted it. You know, when the next rain came, Dennis is nodding his head here, somewhere around Memorial Day. So just assuming something's going to happen doesn't make it happen, and just because it happened in the past doesn't make it happen in the future. The tendency is that way, but pay attention to things like your seedbed, and that starts in the fall, of course. The other thing I heard of was escaped weeds, not managing the fields. I heard resistant weeds, and wild oat was one of them. Koch is another one, which we're familiar with for a long time, and Brad brought up maybe super green foxtail out there. We have high nitrogen costs. That was entering into. I think that's going to be a major factor in your decisions. Soil testing is going to be a really, really important thing this year to define and differentiate where those high nitrogens are and the kinds of cropping decisions that you have coming up. The one I'm not so familiar with at all, and you talked about shortages. I'm not sure what those shortages are. If you were more specific about, maybe you understand what those are, how that might impact your cropping decisions if those shortages actually occur into the cropping season. And the high prices. Nice thing about it, when I looked in the Bismarck Tribune and saw $30 flax, I just scratched my head. I've never seen $30 flax advertised anywhere before. I don't know how common that is in the region, but that's certainly another thing that's going to enter into the cropping decisions that you have, along with the experiences that you have in the past and that you want to provide in the markets. So I would like to encourage questions from you. You've had experiences out there. Was there something that happened last year that you didn't understand? Something that occurred that these fellows might have observed, have some comments about? Questions like, I would like to think about doing this. What do you think about that? And see what their comments are. So I would encourage you to think back now, and if you've got some concerns, I had a question up here about patches of corn not pollinating last year. Empty ears out in the field, and over here were there were good ears and good yield, and so you had this up and down in the field. Things like that you might want to ask into the question. I have a microphone here. If you raise your hand, I'll bring it over there. We'll clean it off, but I almost forgot about that new procedure now. We never used to do that. Any questions? Hi, Jim. Good to see you. Anybody? Thank you, Brian.
Question for Brad, since you mentioned you've seen some rye being used in your area. What benefit have you seen from the rye on the early emerging weeds like wild oat and kochia?
I think some of the, we just got into using rye and planting green into our soybeans into rye. We had a little bit of that going on. The one field that I'm really familiar with was they planted rye and they killed it 10 or 12 days before planting, which maybe was a little late. But basically, with that rye, they knocked the green foxtail back. They knocked some of the small seeded broadleaves back. I'm not so sure how much there was wild oats out there. I don't know how much suppression we got on the wild oats, but what I did notice was the small seeded weeds, really kind, especially the grass seeds, the foxtails, just tended to fall back on those acres from what I've seen with the rye. And when we're starting west of Park River, we're starting to see a lot of use of rye. We had a kind of a challenge last year because our rye came up late and they had to fight through some real dry conditions. So our rye is patchy this year, but I have some slides where it's not patchy too that you'll see tomorrow.
Any concerns out in the crowd about the green foxtail situation that Jason talked about? Or I mean, Brad talked about. Is that widespread in the Lake Region area that you're starting to notice more green foxtail resistance?
I think the hot spot for me is from north of Lake into Highway 17 and south of Darwin into that Petersburg area. And then the worst stuff is within a 5-mile radius of Lincoln, in my opinion. And it's bad there. I mean, it's bad. I mean, they got to do it. We hit them with a couple different modes of action on that one field, and it just didn't seem to, it looked to me like it stopped much. And the wild oats too, is getting to be bad.
So would the panel comment on the effect on crop rotations? I see Jason's going to pick up. That might have an impact on that if chemicals, I assume, are not working as well. Or, so how does the crop rotation fit into that with crop competition, tillage? If we do much tillage at all in those situations, Jason?
For the green foxtail portion, there is getting to be some in Ramsey County, especially northern Ramsey. Cavalier County, there's a fair amount of green foxtail that's tough to kill. Seems like it's always a little harder to kill in edibles for some reason. But crop rotation is just huge. We battle wild oats in northern Ramsey County, Cavalier County. You know, you have to have like a 3-year rotation. You can't expect to get ahead of it by doing wheat, soybeans, wheat. You almost got to get like a soybean canola, a wheat rotation in there. It's so hard, and there's so little out there for us to utilize to kill wild oats anymore, especially up in that northern tier. There's a hole. Every product's got a hole. Every product's got resistance. In my experience, we use Fargo a lot more in the last 3-4 years. And it's spotty at best, so far. Just last year worked a little bit here, didn't work here, attribute part of that to the dry conditions. The year before it was wet, so we didn't get it, worked in properly. But there is times when Fargo can work really well, but there's also times where it hasn't worked well. I had probably more issues last year with it not working than say the previous year. but the rotation is huge. It's just, you know, it's a must.
Where I get most of my calls is probably where it becomes areas around Besedin, Harvey, south of Maddock, where it is dry beans, wheat, dry beans, wheat, dry beans, wheat. Group one, boom, it's wiped out. And this year, even where you didn't have issues, I had fields that had poor control where they started spraying in the early part of the day, and as the day went on, it got worse. Okay, it was pretty good and it got worse. Last year's humidity issue was a big deal, and particularly with clethodim mixed with anything, you needed that humidity to really help you out. It didn't happen. So the antagonism that comes from any of your, if you're using Flexstar in there, if you're using Baristo in there, that was just the year. And it showed up. It was just a tremendous amount of calls. And there was a lot of concern because clethodim's like the last resort on a lot of these products. And if that thing is not performing, then people are really concerned because some of your other ones they just don't have the performance anymore. And you can't afford to lose them in your sunflowers, peas, dry beans, etc.
One of the things that's not very popular, but some of you know this, but I spent about 10 years of my career basically immersed pretty good in the organic industry. And they would go what they call warm season, cool season, winter annual crops. And that's how they would manage some of their weed problems. What is green foxtail? Is that a warm season weed or a cool season weed? It's a warm season weed. You get something growing, it's kind of like millet, it's got to get out of the ground. So if you can, but if you go to the cool season crop, what's wild rose? Kochia. What comes out of the ground? So sometimes you have to throw switch hits at things, and as Jason said, the more diverse your rotations are, the easier it is to control. If you're going corn, soybean, boy, it isn't too hard. Even the corn boards have got this one figured out. They'll wait a year and hop into and come back. They got it figured out. They're not done. We've taught them well. So the more diverse your rotations are, and if you know what my family does, we do a lot of corn, soybeans on Sargent County. But why my brother's been pretty successful with his water hemp and some of his issues is he raises 400 or 500 acres of alfalfa every year. That's a perennial. I think foxtail's going to do well on alfalfa stand? Not if it's a good one. So there are other ways to manage weeds, and rye is a start. I think that we have an opportunity to look at using rye in our soybeans and our dry beans, and we can see some significant weed reductions. And I think Ryan, you can comment on that, but I've seen it.
The reason I asked you the question initially was because I'm going to be showing a slide at 1 o'clock where a study showed that using rye significantly suppressed the kochia population in the spring.
Question, what options are we going to have if we don't, on canola, if we don't get Liberty? What other weed control options will we have?
Legally? About all you've got is so this will play into something that I think is extremely important. Everyone knows the glyphosate situation, the Liberty situation. How important is it that your acres have pre-emerge products on there? Now, we don't have pre-emerge for canola, but you've got Sonalan, you've got Treflan still. The only option really out there is Stinger. If it's, and so that's not a kochia product. Probably the next best thing that you have is a great stand that's established. That's probably the best thing, that was our biggest challenge last year, was we had so much kochia in canola, and Liberty performance was it was a tough year for it. So that is a big concern that I have with that crop. Because then it almost becomes almost conventional. I mean, if your only option is stinger and it's clethodim, it's just like conventional.
I think Jason brought up something that's really important with canola, and that is the stand. Tend to want to reduce costs, of course, and when seed beds are not adequate, you end up with this widespread weed problem and herbicide dependent. When canola first started coming in here in 79, 80, and 81, of course we had lots of problems with weeds. We had trifluralin, ethylene, not Paul, but Trefon. And they had a lot of weed escapes, but one thing we found out with canola is that it's so darn competitive. If you can get a stand, it'll take care of itself. And the weeds may be there, but they don't go to seed, and they eventually dissipate. And I think that's true for all our crops. The good stand is a good way to start your weed control program, is to make sure you have adequate population, whatever that is. Don't pay attention to the seed bed all the time, and then have adequate population. But last year it was dry, got seeded a little deep, and then these problems happen, and then you live with them for the next couple of years at least. You can't do anything about it. Was interesting in the conversation that you had a little bit earlier when you talked about it. Brad was talking about competitive crops. Canola would be quite competitive. That's one of our, we used to talk about tall crops versus semi-dwarfs with more interception of the sun and less for the weeds and so on. And some of those things have tended to dissipate. In the 80s, again, when buccal, trifluralin, and Fargo came on the scene for weed control, one of the things that inadvertently happened when we were incorporating triolate into the soil was that we created a seed bed for foxtail. And one of the things with the press drill, when you pressed it in between, you left it loose in between, and it didn't grow until the rain came along and wet that down and gave the wheat a week or two, maybe a competitive advantage, and it would help take the foxtail out. When it was tall, it wasn't a problem. I guess what I'm trying to say is that when we started to harrow in, we created a wheat seed bed for foxtail, both green mostly here, and then yellow started to come in. And then we started putting trifluralin down, and then we had buccal, so we had to seed deep. Then we had poorer stands because it couldn't merge. Then we got into semi-dwarfs, it didn't merge quite as well, and we created more weed problems. So the post-emergence, when it came along with Hold-On, helped out a lot with alleviating the tillage issue that we had gotten into with harrowing. So some of these things evolve over time. We're not realizing, I think that's what Jason was talking about, both of you were talking about, was the lack of rotation, or you get into something that's similar. Biologically, things are going to adapt if you do the same thing all the time. They're going to adapt.
One other item that jogged my memory. If you lay down some of these herbicides, you better look at your carryover. Some areas in Walsh County didn't make 10 inches. And some of that stuff still, Sonolin's still going to be there. Some of your other air products going to be there. Your compiler lids, they're going to be a problem. You might want to review what you laid down and how much, and what your possibility of carryover is going to be. Because I would hate to wake up in June and July and wondering why my crop was dying and find out that it was a carryover deal. And a lot of these haven't.
Yeah, we had a huge issue in 88, 89 with that, with carryover of the residual products due to lack of rain. Typically, we're used to it. You get a half inch or an inch of rain during the season, and then another one, and they'll break down some. But when it's totally dry on the surface like that, especially over 60 days, or if you don't have 30 to 40 days of biological or other breakdown, you can end up with residuals. So pay attention to that too. There was a question over here earlier too, and yeah,
Yeah, I heard somebody say that if you're gonna mix something with clethodim, that you should double the rate of clethodim. Would you agree with that?
I don't know if you need to double the rate of clethodim, but what I have found and what I wish I could get most of my producers to do is if you're spraying clethodim with anything, especially like edible beans, peas, I wish you would do the clethodim by itself. The antagonism is, it's just so much, it works poorly. It's so much better if you can go out and do a single application with the clethodim. Doubling the rate, no, I don't think you need to double the rate. I would definitely go the high rate now, but by itself, we'll spray it by itself, 10 gallons of water, do it the right way, and it'll work. It works way better on its own instead of trying to make, save that one pass. I know a pass still costs you a little money, but 2 passes or 3 passes to come back and try to spray grasses one more time, costs you more money too. I guess that's kind of my thoughts on clethodim. I wish everybody would just spray it by itself, especially on the edible part. Not so much on the canola, you got the phosphate there to help. But when you're talking sunflowers, you're talking dry beans, conventional soybeans, anything like that, I would just as soon see you spray that clethodim all by itself and then come back with your other herbicides later.
And if you do that, I would agree. If that can be done, you can spray your grass first, and your broadleaf you can come back the next day. But if you do it in reverse, you spray your broadleaf first, you got a longer wait period to do your grass. So the easiest thing is to spray your grass first, and then start back on broadleaf. A lot less issues.
Concerning liberty availability, would it be even possible or advisable to seek a emergency exemption from the use of Prowl H2O on canola?
I don't think you can if you've already got trifluralin and sonalan labeled. I think that with something already there that's in the same family, I can't see that happening. I think they'll just say, you've already got an alternative that's very similar. We're not going to go through the process.
Okay, any other questions? Yep.
So on the subject of biologicals from enhancers to plant health, any thoughts?
I think one of the things so to me, that's the next stage of where agriculture is probably going to go. The challenge that I see is that testing those and having reliable data is extremely hard to do. And for someone or a company to have a product that's going to fit over a broad geographical area on multiple crops, I think is a pipe dream. I think a lot of these products are going to be environmentally crop specific, and you're going to do it right, you're probably going to have to carry quite a load of inventory. And that's not fun, it's not cool, but it's really tough to get the testing done on those products because of think of all the testing that's been done in universities in this country on nitrogen, and we still argue about nitrogen. I just wonder how this is going to go when it comes to biologicals, because it's going to be so much harder to test, whether that's a soil applied or a foliar. So I look at stuff like that. I take caution. I talk to counterparts here in extension and private industry. What have you seen? What have you heard? Have you tried it? Have you looked at it? It's just, I'm stepping my foot into the shallow end of the pool at this point.
I think, you know what, and I think he hit on it exactly right, is that first question that I ask is there any issue research? Is there any what I consider research I'm comfortable with within the tri-state area, and the more local the better. Biologicals is sometimes kind of like trying to catch smoke. It really is. And it depends upon humidity, it depends upon a lot of different things. And what I see with a lot of those is erratic results sometimes. But I mean, if you want to try some of them and it doesn't cost you so much, do a little on-farm experiment demonstration project or experiment project to see if it's going to work for you. I'm not saying don't throw down 400 acres, but you want to try 20, 30 acres and see if it's probably not going to drive you out of business. But those are, like you just alluded to, the data is so elusive.
I think you have to pay attention to biologicals operate a little differently than herbicides or chemicals, organic or inorganic chemicals. And they're living things that interact with living things. And they depend on one another's population and so on. So that's another thing. I think you probably come into that using them with different expectations than what you probably should have with outcomes and how quick they're going to work and how long they're going to last or what the long lasting part of it would be.
One of the things, the biologicals, where the biologicals have been effective, or what I call semi-effective, has been in the insect world. We have had as much success there as not. But you know what, again, I spent 10 years in the organic industry, and then we're spraying some of Bacillus thuringiensis and some of those things. You know, you go out there and if you're spraying Bacillus thuringiensis and you think your grasshopper population is going to crash in 2 days, think again. You got to be in front of it, because if you're going into a mess with a biological, I've never seen really great success.
Any other questions? We have about 10 minutes for more opportunities here to interact.
It was mentioned earlier about clethodim mechanism. Do you see it being a problem down the road with some of our other common mixes? You know, for several years now, dicamba or, Ingenia and Roundup or glyphosate's been a common mix. Do you see us down the road having to separate those into separate passes down the road, or any other popular mixes?
I guess for the dicamba Roundup, I have not seen any, obviously the clethodim with the Roundup and dicamba is, there's quite a bit of antagonism there. I have not seen, the issue yet with dicamba Roundup. I suppose it is possible in the future, but at this point in time, no. I guess I have not seen that.
Most of what I see is where you tank mix systemic products with contact products. That's where you see it. So glyphosate being systemic, dicamba being systemic, I don't see that issue. But if you take a systemic grass product in wheat and tank mix it with the bromoxynil containing product, you can have some, 4 or 5% antagonism. So that's kind of where most of it that you see. So that's why when Jason was talking about separating them out, you kind of get rid of that factor in that equation. So a lot of the times the contact products, they just are, there are a lot of salts and weak acids. So there's some effect there.
Well, then your mode of action too, you get a contact that destroys something right away, and then you've got a systemic that you want to get absorbed into the system. It doesn't have a chance to do it. Depends on the weed, of course, that you're looking after, but that particular part, anytime you add something to it, you're always going to have some kind of interaction. And if you have environmental things that are extreme like we did last year, you can exacerbate that whole situation as well. It might have worked the year before, it might not work this year. So you have to pay some close attention to what it is you're trying to do there. Any other questions? Anybody going to raise more sunflower this year?
Any of you starting to see an increase in common ragweed? We did a sunflower survey this fall, and one of the things that shocked me, we were in 4 counties, and the number one weed that bit me was common ragweed. It was pretty much strewn up and down those fields. Why is common ragweed of concern? glyphosate resistance and resistance to the common ragweed. There's another one, you need to know what common ragweed looks like. Because if those sunflower fields we were in this fall were any indication, that's another up and coming one.
It's kind of interesting to hear all the statements about resistant weeds, and it seemed that the last 10 years of my career here, we talked a lot about resistant weeds and what to do about it. And it seemed there was lots of yawns out there because there were also alternatives. But it kind of sounds to me like 10 to 15 years down the road, some of those alternatives are starting to disappear. And then we're going to have to go back to looking at our cultural practices, our rotation, competitiveness of crops, seed bed establishment, fall tillage or lack of, or what kind of that you're doing in those situations, and reconsidering other long-term competitive crops and that interaction. It gets really complicated because of prices of not only the commodity, but seed and input costs that go along with that, and stored soil moisture and so on. Any other questions? We've got time for one. Well, Scott, I don't hear any, and we're down to about 5 minutes. I noticed, reminded me again too, that we always depended on these things to show up with somebody from Fargo, whoever it was that brought them this time, but I see they're still cold, and they just came out of the box. And here's the weed control guide up here, and insect field management guide that just kind of came. So if you're interested in one of those, I'm sure Scott will encourage you to go and get it.
Terry, how thick was that weed control guide when you started?
Yeah, this is kind of well, I've got 3 minutes. When I started in '78, the weed control guide was about 10 pages long, maybe. And I just visited with Jay Fisher when I was at Minot this last summer. I hadn't seen Jay for quite a while. And when we were on the trip down to Minneapolis for the North Central Weed Control meeting, Larry Middich was in the car with me, John Nalloway was driving, Jay and I, and somebody else. I don't remember the other person. But in the meantime, I had started tearing this thing apart at the office to try to redo it because it was mostly a narrative and that type of thing. We didn't have the tables, we didn't have the narrative in the back. And so that whole trip down there and half the way back, we were talking about how to put this thing back together in a different way. So when I came back, I think it was Kim at the time, secretary, she tore it apart and we cut and paste. We didn't have computers and do all this stuff, but we cut the thing out, we pasted it and sent it to Larry. He added a table of contents on the thing and some narratives in back. And since then, Rich Zollinger and Brian and Greg and all kinds of people have been involved in that thing, and it's grown into one, and has been for a long time, a tremendous reference for weed control guides. But that's kind of where this whole thing started. I remember it distinctly, and then Jay reminded me of that last summer that we were in that car putting this thing together. So it's a great resource.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank all the panel members and Terry for moderating it.